Imagine dedicating decades of your life to your family, giving up your dreams, working sleepless nights, and in the end, hearing your own son laugh when he sees you crying. Hard to believe, isn't it? But that's exactly what happened to me. And in that moment, something inside me broke. And at the same time, something else was rebuilt. Most people would say I should swallow the pain, wait for an apology, and move on. But I chose the opposite. I turned that humiliation into silent revenge. And on the very same day, I rewrote the future of my inheritance. Instead of rewarding ingratitude, I gave everything to those who would truly value it. Young strangers, hungry for education and dignity. Here's the irony. The greatest loss of my life became my greatest liberation. Because when family betrays our trust, we're left with two choices: remain chained to resentment, or use the pain as fuel to build something greater. That's what I chose to do. So prepare yourself. This is not just a story about money. It's a story about respect, about the price of ingratitude, and about how life always finds a way to return double what we give to others. I never imagined betrayal could come in such a quiet, almost ordinary yet devastating way. I was in my study, surrounded by books that carried centuries of wisdom, when the tears started to fall. They weren't tears of weakness, but of exhaustion, the result of years spent devoted to education, to family, to respect. I, a man who always believed that dignity is born from daily effort, felt reduced to a shadow. And it was then that Jason, my own son, walked into the room. He didn't say anything, didn't ask a single question. He just laughed. He laughed at the sight of his father in tears, as if my pain was some kind of joke. The humiliation I felt cut so deep it seemed impossible to put into words. That laugh wasn't just a thoughtless reaction. It was like an invisible slap, full of contempt. I could have endured any insult from a stranger, but not from the very person who carried my name, who grew up in the home I built with so much sacrifice. In that instant, it was as if a lifetime's investment in education, values, and character had evaporated into thin air. Respect, the pillar I always believed family bonds rested upon, was crushed in seconds. And still, I didn't raise my voice. I stayed silent, because I had long ago learned that true emotion doesn't need to shout to be real. Have you ever experienced something like that? Maybe not with a child, but with someone close who mocked your pain or dismissed your effort. It's like being stripped bare in front of the very person who should have protected you. Betrayal, in those moments, doesn't come through grand acts of cruelty, but in the refusal to even recognize another person's humanity. In Jason's eyes, I didn't just see coldness. I saw a kind of cruel satisfaction, as if my weakness was proof of his strength. And that kind of humiliation brands the soul. But life has its ironies. Sometimes it's in our deepest pain that we discover the path to freedom. While he laughed, something inside me woke up. It wasn't hate. It wasn't the urge for immediate revenge. It was clarity, the realization that I no longer needed to beg for respect inside my own family. Dignity isn't requested, it's claimed. And in that moment, I understood that true liberation would come from my action, not his change. I could have stood up, yelled, demanded an apology. But what would that accomplish? Words forced out of guilt or obligation have no value. Silence, however, carries a weight that lingers. And in that silence, my mind began to work. I remembered every night I spent grading papers just to make ends meet, every book I bought to encourage Jason to study, every opportunity I sacrificed so he could have better chances. All those years of dedication, all that education I had passed on, thrown back in my face with a single laugh. And then I realized life had placed the perfect opportunity in my hands. In the middle of humiliation, I could turn pain into revenge, not petty revenge, but a teaching one, the kind that leaves a mark. Because real lessons don't always happen in classrooms, but in the trials life puts before us. My grief transformed into fuel. I knew I could no longer remain the passive man I had been. I had to act. Here's the strange part. Humiliation can become a powerful lever, like a spring. The more it's pressed down, the stronger it rebounds. Jason's laughter pushed me to rock bottom, but it also gave me the push to think of something that would change not only my future, but his as well. It was time to flip the script, to prove that dignity isn't a bargaining chip. It's an unshakable inheritance. And that inheritance, no one could ever take from me. As Jason left the room still laughing, I felt as if he had unknowingly signed the beginning of a new story. A story in which I would stop being the humiliated father and become the man who used pain as strategy for freedom. That moment, which could have been my end, became my beginning. Because sometimes, all it takes is a spark to ignite transformation. And that laugh, paradoxically, was the spark that reignited my fire. I said nothing. I simply wiped my tears, straightened the leather briefcase on my desk, and took a deep breath. But inside, I already knew. I was about to make a decision that would change everything. A decision that, in silence, was already taking shape. One that would become the greatest turning point of my life. Even as my son's laughter echoed in my mind, I found myself traveling back in time. I remembered every morning I left the house before dawn to teach in a public school. The teacher's lounge smelled of burnt coffee, and piles of essays towered over the desk. I would spend hours correcting poorly written assignments, believing that each revision was a seed planted in the soil of education. I did it not only for my students, but for my family, convinced that investing in knowledge was building a future of dignity for all of us. But looking at Jason now, it felt as though all that effort had been erased, as if my entire story was nothing more than a forgotten footnote in his life. That feeling is devastating. Imagine working decades, giving up personal dreams, just to lift up someone you love, only to be met with scorn. It's like building a house brick by brick, only to watch it torn down by the very person who should have cherished it. This kind of betrayal doesn't use knives or weapons, but quiet actions that corrode the soul, and the humiliation of realizing your own family despises what should have been your legacy. That's a wound words can barely hold. How many times did I pass on buying a new suit because Jason needed expensive college books? How many nights did I stay awake preparing lessons just to bring in a little extra income so nothing would be missing at home? A teacher's life is rarely comfortable. My old car broke down so often it felt like part of the family. But every sacrifice was made with emotion, with the conviction that education would transform not only my students, but also my own son. And yet, years of dedication were thrown to the ground with a single laugh. Memory works in strange ways. I remembered the very first time Jason asked me to help with a school project. I spent hours with him in the library, teaching him how to find references, organize ideas, and respect the value of knowledge. That day, I felt proud. I believed I was passing on more than information. I was teaching respect, discipline, and a sense of dignity. But as the years went by, that spark seemed to fade. What was left was a man who now looked at his father as a burden, instead of seeing him as the root of his own story. And maybe that's the biggest problem with family relationships, when the effort of one becomes invisible to the other. It's like watering a plant every day, only to watch it never bloom. Love, care, silent dedication, all of it can vanish when there's no recognition. Betrayal doesn't always come through harsh words, but through actions that erase everything that was done. The humiliation of being treated as irrelevant by your own child is a weight that corrodes the soul far more than any financial debt. But here's the truth. That weight, as painful as it is, doesn't have to crush us. It can be turned into energy, like coal that under pressure becomes a diamond. Revenge in this sense isn't about cruel punishment. It's about transforming pain into a gesture that reveals the value that was denied. That's what I began to feel in that moment, the possibility of freedom. If Jason refused to see what I had done for him, then maybe it was time to show the world, not just him, the weight of my story. Life always gives us choices. I could drown in self-pity, replaying the list of ingratitudes in my head, burning with anger. Or I could use that contempt as fuel to write a new chapter. And that's exactly what I began to plan, still in silence. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge is the one born from serenity, the kind that doesn't need shouting or violence, but through a single act, reveals a truth people prefer to ignore. As I reflected, I realized something important. Respect cannot be inherited. It has to be earned daily. Jason believed he was entitled to everything simply because he was my son. The house, the savings, the future I had set aside. But inheritance is not a prize for sharing blood. It's the result of respect and gratitude. And if all he had offered me was humiliation, then he couldn't expect rewards. That clarity gave me strength. I knew I was ready to take a step that would change not only my relationship with my son, but also the way I viewed life itself. And so, between painful memories and deep reflection, an idea began to take shape within me. A quiet idea, almost imperceptible, but one with the power to turn everyone's life upside down. Because sometimes, after being ignored for years, the greatest act of freedom is to choose, unexpectedly, a path no one sees coming. There are moments when life places us at a silent crossroads. No signs pointing the way, no voices telling us what to do, just the weight of humiliation and the clarity born from it. After Jason's laugh, I sat at my old wooden desk, which knew my secrets better than anyone. I opened the drawer, and there it was. My worn leather briefcase, aged with time but filled with meaning. Inside lay everything I had built over a lifetime of work and sacrifice: the deed to the house, financial investments, certificates, and at the very bottom, a check for $300,000 that I had saved especially for my son's future. Holding that check was like holding my own history. Every number printed on it represented sleepless nights, tight paychecks, the quiet victories that only I knew, and my unshakable faith that education was the greatest inheritance I could leave. The money itself was just a reflection of that, a tangible symbol of all the dignity I had fought to preserve. But looking at that slip of paper, the contrast was glaring. On one side, the father who believed in family. On the other, the son who laughed at pain, treating respect like a cheap currency. The decision began to mature inside me. I could have left things as they were, pretended nothing had happened, and kept Jason as the natural heir. It would have been the easiest, most predictable path. But at the same time, it would have meant rewarding betrayal and ingratitude. It would have been like paying back humiliation with privilege. No, I couldn't allow that cycle to continue. I needed to break the pattern that turned sacrifice into disdain. Revenge, at that moment, stopped being an ugly word and became something else, a rightful response, a kind of poetic justice. It's funny how the deepest decisions rarely arrive with noise. They come in silence, like a whisper only those who've lived enough can hear. As I held that check, I thought of all the talented young people who never had a chance simply because they were born without resources. I thought of the faces I had seen throughout my career, students who dropped out of school because they had to work too early. And suddenly, it all made sense. Why should I leave such a fortune in the hands of someone who mocked my pain, when I could use it to transform the lives of hundreds of young people? Freedom was right there in front of me, clearer than ever. I remember taking a deep breath and looking around. The walls were lined with history books, many of them worn until their covers fell apart. Each volume was proof that education doesn't just inform, it shapes character, strengthens families, and restores dignity. That study wasn't just a physical place, it was the sanctuary of my entire journey. And it was there, surrounded by memories and the emotion of a life dedicated to teaching, that I mentally signed the most important decision of my life. I didn't need to announce anything. Silence was enough. Jason, in the next room, was busy planning trips, luxury cars, the life of an heir who had never valued the effort behind the fortune. He had no idea that, at that very moment, the inheritance he thought was his had already changed course. That contrast between his illusion and my decision was, in itself, a silent revenge. Not the kind that screams, but the kind that teaches. Because the real lesson isn't in the words we speak, it's in the actions we take when no one is expecting them. And here's something for you to reflect on. How many times do you hold on to situations out of fear of breaking a cycle of disrespect? How many times do you keep feeding family ties that don't recognize your worth simply because habit speaks louder than dignity? Sometimes liberation requires courage, the courage to make unpopular choices. Choices that may seem harsh at first, but deep down, they're the only ones capable of restoring your self-respect. I learned that lesson holding that check. And maybe you need to learn it too, in your own life, that it's not about money, but about self-worth. I closed the briefcase calmly, as if ending a chapter, but with the certainty that another one was about to begin. There was no rush, no need for explanations at that moment. Silence carried a power Jason still didn't understand. I knew that with a single signature, I could redraw the future for everyone, and that awareness, paradoxically, didn't burden me, but gave me a strange peace. It felt as if I had finally found a way to turn humiliation into freedom, and it was in that state of serenity that I rose from my chair. The briefcase remained there, like a secret locked away, waiting for the right time to be revealed. Jason, oblivious to it all, kept laughing at grand plans that no longer existed, and I, in silence, carried with me not just documents, but the seed of a decision that would change lives. Because life, my friend, is made of choices, and mine, at that moment, was already made. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The sun had barely risen, and the stillness of the house contrasted with the storm that had been inside me since the night before. I grabbed the leather briefcase, heavy not only with documents, but with the decision it carried. Every step toward the door felt strange, like I was walking toward my own liberation. The cold morning air brought me clarity. I knew this wasn't about money, but about dignity. It was my chance to turn humiliation into something greater. My destination was the Bright Minds Foundation, an institution I didn't know personally, but one I had long admired. During my years as a teacher, I saw brilliant students lose opportunities simply because they lacked the basics: school supplies, transportation, a scholarship. Many times, I gave them my own books or paid out of pocket so a student could participate in an academic competition. And even with my own limitations, I always felt the joy of seeing education change lives. Now, I was about to take that to another level. I walked into the foundation with steady steps, though my heart was racing. The walls were filled with photos of smiling graduates, medals from competitions, diplomas that might never have existed without that help. When the secretary saw me, she greeted me kindly and asked if I had an appointment. I said no, but asked to speak with the director. Minutes later, Caroline, a woman with a warm but steady gaze, came out to meet me. I shook her hand calmly, realizing this was a moment I'd remember forever. We sat in her office. I pulled the documents from my briefcase, spread them on the desk, and placed the $1.3 million check on top. The silence that followed felt almost sacred. Caroline's eyes widened, her hand covered her mouth, and for a few seconds, she couldn't say a word. After taking a deep breath, she whispered, "Are you sure?" I smiled and replied, "More sure than ever. This money wasn't built just for my blood family, but for the family education gave me, my students, and all the young people still to come." Seeing tears well in her eyes is something I'll never forget. Caroline stood up, came around the desk, and held my hands tightly. "Professor Edward, what you're doing isn't just a donation. It's an act of respect for humanity. It's revenge against the injustice of life, which so often denies opportunities to those who deserve them most." Her words touched me deeply because they put into words exactly what I felt: liberation. The humiliation I had endured at home was now being transformed into hope for others. That office became a stage for reflection. I thought about how family relationships can disappoint us, but also about how we hold the power to redefine our pain. Jason believed my inheritance would be his passport to a life of luxury, but I had just proven that money has real value only when it transforms lives. Dignity, after all, isn't in the size of a bank account. It's in what we choose to do with it. There, between papers and tears, I understood that my revenge wasn't against him, but against the ingratitude that so many parents silently endure. Caroline promised that the donation would be used with full responsibility, creating full scholarships, mental health support programs, and opportunities that would change generations. She made a point of saying my family's name would be remembered as a symbol of hope. I shook my head gently and replied, "I don't want this to be about me or Jason. I want it to be about the power of education, about how it can restore dignity where there was humiliation." It wasn't just altruism. It was the way I had found to free my heart from the weight of betrayal. When I left the foundation, the cold wind hit my face, but this time it didn't sting. On the contrary, it felt like a breath of renewal. I walked slowly to my car, the briefcase now light, almost empty, but my soul full. It was as if I had taken a boulder off my chest. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel defeated. I felt victorious, because I realized that the greatest revenge against ingratitude is to transform pain into life, tears into lessons, humiliation into freedom. And little did I know, that gesture, carried out in silence, wouldn't stay hidden for long. Caroline had said, with a spark in her eyes, that something this big couldn't go unnoticed. I just smiled, but deep down I knew the truth always finds its way to the surface. And when it did, not only I, but my whole family would feel the impact of that decision. I returned home after that meeting at the foundation, carrying what felt like a precious secret. The drive back seemed lighter, even if the memories still weighed on me. I walked through the front door and found Jason sprawled on the couch, phone in hand. He was laughing at silly videos, chatting with friends about trips, luxury cars, and heirs' dreams. He had no idea that while he drowned in fantasies of grandeur, the family's future had already changed forever. The silence I kept in that moment was my first act of revenge, letting him believe the world still revolved around him. It's strange how humiliation can sneak even into the smallest details of everyday life. Hearing my own son talk about mansions and parties, knowing he hadn't lifted a finger to earn any of it, was like watching betrayal in slow motion. I, who had worked decades to guarantee the family's dignity, saw before me a man trapped in illusions. I said nothing because I had learned that some lessons don't need to be delivered immediately. Silence, in this case, was my way of teaching, letting time reveal the truth more powerfully than any lecture could. As he spoke, I remembered how many times I sacrificed my own dreams. I thought of the trip I never took because the money had to go toward his college tuition, Of the home renovation I kept putting off because Jason wanted a newer car. Of the worn-out clothes I continued wearing because I chose instead to invest in his future. That wasn't just a father's love. It was proof that family had always been my top priority. And yet, what I received in return was the cruel laugh of humiliation. Moments like that teach us that respect cannot be bought with checks or gifts. It is earned through daily gratitude. I could have exploded right there, thrown his ingratitude in his face. But I chose calm instead. I understood that my freedom wouldn't come from harsh words, but from the serenity of knowing I had already done my part. I no longer needed to beg for recognition because life had already given me clarity. There is no greater revenge than proving you can live with happiness and dignity without depending on the approval of those who betrayed you. Dignity isn't about shouting that you deserve respect. It's about living in such a way that no one can deny your worth. And I'll admit, there was a certain bittersweet satisfaction in watching his innocence, his blind belief that the inheritance was still intact. It was like watching an actor perform a role without realizing the script had already been rewritten. With every word he spoke about, "When I get my money," my heart grew stronger, because I knew the surprise waiting for him wouldn't just be a financial shock, it would be a life lesson. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that life teaches much harder lessons when we refuse to learn them the easy way. That night, the house felt strangely silent, even with Jason's voice echoing through the halls. Maybe because I no longer heard his words the same way. They no longer stabbed like knives. Now they were just the echoes of an illusion about to collapse. The real melody playing inside me was the certainty of my decision. That silence became my fortress. When you carry a true purpose within you, you don't need to prove anything to anyone. Time itself will reveal the truth. It's important for you to understand this too. Often within families we face betrayals disguised as neglect, humiliations hidden behind jokes, disrespect masked by silence. In those moments, the temptation is to react, to explode, to demand, to lash out. But sometimes, the wisest revenge is strategic silence. It isn't cowardice, it's preparation. Because when the truth finally surfaces, no one will be able to say you didn't warn them. And the freedom that comes from that is powerful, because it shows that dignity is never requested, it is demonstrated. That night, I slept peacefully. Jason, in his room, was dreaming of trips, parties, and a future that would never unfold the way he imagined. I, in mine, slept with the peace of a man who had made the right choice. But life is ironic. The silence that seemed to protect my secret wouldn't last long. By the next morning, the entire city would know what I had done. And what was liberation for me would be the beginning of a public humiliation for Jason that he would never forget. The silence I had guarded at home lasted only a few hours. Early the next morning, when I opened the door to pick up the newspaper, the headline on the front page seemed larger than the paper itself. Retired teacher donates $1 million fortune to fund education for underprivileged youth. There was my name, Edward, right alongside a photo Caroline had taken the day before, surrounded by smiling students. Emotion overwhelmed me. It wasn't vanity. It was the pure sense of liberation. The humiliation Jason had inflicted on me just days earlier had now been transformed into a headline of hope for the world. I walked back inside, holding that newspaper, feeling each word like a healing balm. It was as if all those years of sacrifice had finally found their echo. Education, which I had always considered a family's greatest treasure, was now being recognized as a force capable of transforming entire lives. The dignity Jason tried to strip from me with his mocking laughter returned multiplied in respect, not only from the community, but from an entire society hungry for examples. It was living proof that a life of sacrifice is never in vain. Jason, of course, didn't take long to wake up. He came into the kitchen with his phone in hand, and I could see the look in his eyes even from a distance. His expression wasn't pride, nor positive surprise. It was, rage. A mixture of betrayal and frustration only someone who feels entitled to everything could display. "Have you lost your mind, Dad? That was mine. How could you do this to me?" Those were his first words. They hit like a punch to the gut, not because of their content, but because of the blindness behind them. He couldn't see that this wasn't about money, but about respect and gratitude. That scene made me reflect on how family ties are so often corroded by the illusion of inheritance. How many sons, daughters, and grandchildren turn their families into battlefields over material possessions. They forget that the true legacy isn't the sum of dollars, but the sum of values passed down. Jason saw betrayal where there was love. He saw humiliation where there was education. For him, my gesture was an attack. For me, it was freedom. Revenge, in this case, wasn't aimed at him. It was aimed at ingratitude itself, a way to show the world that dignity can't be bought, only earned. The hours that followed were a whirlwind. Old colleagues from school called me in tears. Journalists wanted interviews. Former students sent messages thanking me for the example. Many said they finally had someone to show their families that respect isn't in hoarding wealth, but in sharing it. Every word I received was like another brick rebuilding the wall Jason had tried to tear down with his laugh. Emotion flooded me, but it was a calm emotion. The certainty that life was giving back what I once thought I had lost. Jason, meanwhile, spiraled into fury. I watched him pace the room, shouting that I had ruined his plans, that I had betrayed him, that now everyone would laugh at him. He didn't realize that the real humiliation wasn't in losing money but in revealing to the world that his only concern was himself. His reaction, in a way, confirmed that I had made the right choice. The freedom I had sought wasn't only mine, it was his too, even if he wasn't mature enough to see it yet. And here's a lesson. Often, when you do the right thing, you'll be seen as the villain by those who benefited from your silence. Betrayal, in those cases, is nothing more than the reflection of a wounded ego, but don't let it shake you. The truest revenge against ingratitude is to stand firm in your principles, even if it costs you the shallow love of those who never valued you. The dignity you carry defines your story, not the opinion of those who chose the shortcut of disrespect. I closed my eyes. For a moment, still holding the newspaper, and thought about life's irony. I, who had been humiliated inside my own home, was now celebrated outside of it. That contrast made me smile, not because I wanted to see Jason suffer, but because I understood that every choice carries a consequence. He chose to laugh at his father's pain. I chose to turn that pain into freedom for hundreds of young people. And in the end, life always reveals who was right. The day ended with a bittersweet feeling. On the one hand, the joy of seeing education take center stage and of feeling once again the respect that had been denied to me. On the other, the sadness of realizing that my own son couldn't celebrate with me. But I knew the story wasn't over yet. Because when you touch the ego of someone who has never learned to deal with limits, confrontation becomes inevitable. And that confrontation, I could already feel, was about to come. I already knew Jason's reaction would be harsh. When someone lives, believing the world exists to serve them, any contradiction feels like betrayal. Still, I'll admit, I wasn't prepared for the intensity of the storm that followed. He barged into my study like a hurricane, slamming the newspaper onto my desk and accusing me of being ungrateful, of destroying the family, of humiliating him in front of everyone. The anger in his eyes seemed to fill the room. For a moment, I no longer saw the boy I had once taught to write, but a man consumed by ego, incapable of recognizing his own father's dignity. I stayed silent. I let him spit out every word dripping with hatred, as if it were some kind of purge. "You're a traitor, Dad. You gave my inheritance away to strangers. How could you do this to your own family?" he shouted, as though the blood running through our veins entitled him to privileges. His emotion wasn't sadness, it was fury. And this is where life delivers a harsh truth. Family relationships aren't always synonymous with respect. Too often, they're stages for ingratitude, where humiliation comes precisely from those we should trust most. When silence finally settled over the room, I took a deep breath and answered calmly, "Jason, a man who laughs at his father's pain doesn't deserve an inheritance. He needs a lesson." My voice wasn't shaky or aggressive. It was steady, like a sentence being passed down. It wasn't revenge in the cheap sense of the word. It was justice. It was the kind of response education had taught me. You don't correct ingratitude with shouting, but with clear boundaries. I wanted him to understand that dignity cannot be bought, cannot be inherited. It has to be earned, day after day, in every act of respect. I remember the look on his face, stunned, as if he had never heard such words before. And maybe he hadn't. I had always been there for him, always fulfilled his wishes, always covered his mistakes with the blanket of paternal love. But there, in that moment, stood the naked truth. My silence was over. His betrayal had opened a wound that could only be healed by an even deeper cut, the removal of what he thought was guaranteed. It was the end of the illusion. And at that instant, I realized something. Raising children doesn't end when they graduate from college. Parenting is a lifelong commitment, even when the lesson has to hurt. Jason tried to argue back, saying I was being cruel, that this was humiliating him in front of society, that now everyone would laugh at him. I gave him a faint smile. Society doesn't laugh at people who lose money, Jason. It laughs at people who lose their character. Those words cut through the air like blades. And they were true. The world may forgive financial bankruptcy, but it never forgets moral bankruptcy. Life's revenge is simple. Those who disrespect their parents end up disrespecting themselves, and sooner or later, the debt comes due. At that moment, there was a loud knock at the door. Jason froze, startled. The fury on his face turned into confusion. I stood up calmly, walked to the entrance, and opened it. To my surprise, and to his utter despair, there stood Caroline, the director of the foundation, accompanied by 2 local journalists. They had come to personally thank me for the donation and ask permission to record the moment on video. Jason turned pale. The private confrontation was about to become public. Life, once again, revealed its irony. It wasn't enough for the lesson to remain within 4 walls. Truth would have to be exposed before everyone. And here's a reflection. So often, when we think we control the narrative, fate steps in to show us who truly writes the story. Jason believed he could intimidate me with shouting, that he could shame me in the privacy of our home. But the unexpected arrival of the press turned his fury into a spectacle. There was no longer any way to hide his reaction. And this is the moment when humiliation changes sides. The humiliator becomes the humiliated, not through the cruel revenge of another, but through his own inability to recognize what respect truly is. The stage was set. Caroline walked in, smiling, and began to speak about the impact that donation would have on the lives of thousands of young people. The journalists turned on their cameras, recording every detail. Jason, overwhelmed by emotion, tried to interrupt, but what came out of his mouth wasn't recognition, nor even a sharp criticism. It was blind rage, and that rage would be filmed, broadcast, and shared. The confrontation he sought with me would become his own downfall. At that moment, I realized I didn't need to say another word. Life itself was carrying forward what I had begun. My liberation no longer depended on my voice, but on his inability to hide who he really was. And as the cameras rolled, I knew this was the definitive turning point. Because sometimes you don't need to raise your hand or raise your voice to win. You only need to stand firm in your own dignity and let the world see for itself the difference between those who respect and those who betray. When I opened the door and saw Caroline with the journalists, I understood that life had orchestrated a twist even I couldn't have imagined. Until that moment, the conflict with Jason had been confined to 4 walls, an intimate duel between father and son, between pain and ingratitude. But suddenly, my living room had become the stage for something much bigger. Caroline entered smiling, carrying with her the energy of gratitude, as if in her eyes shone the reflection of all the young people who would benefit from the donation. Jason, on the other hand, stood frozen, as if caught in the very act of betrayal. She thanked me publicly, in front of the cameras, speaking about how that gesture represented not just financial help, but a symbol of hope for thousands of students. You haven't just given money, Professor Edward. You've given respect and dignity to those who are so often treated with indifference by society, Caroline said, her voice breaking with emotion. Her words echoed deeply within me. It was as if every humiliation I had endured in life, whether through low salaries or through my own family's disregard, was being redefined in that moment, before everyone. Jason couldn't stand it. Consumed by a mix of anger and desperation, he tried to interrupt. "This is ridiculous. He betrayed his own family to give money to strangers," he shouted, pointing at me in front of the cameras. It was as though he was trying to turn his fury into justification, but the attempt was useless. Caroline, calm and unwavering, replied simply, "Family isn't defined only by blood, but by respect and by what we build together. Today, Mr. Edward is expanding the very meaning of family, and that's something we should all learn." Jason's expression collapsed into pure humiliation. It was in that moment I realized how life's revenge is silent, yet precise. I didn't have to raise my voice. I didn't have to expose his failures. He himself, unable to control his emotions, revealed to the world exactly who he was. A selfish man, incapable of recognizing the value of education or the dignity of his own father. The cameras caught everything, every word, every outburst of rage, every look of contempt, and within hours, those images would be shared, watched, and judged by thousands. And that's exactly what happened. The video went viral at lightning speed. Social media, newspapers, even television programs began to debate the scene. On one side, the figure of a retired teacher who had dedicated his life to education and, even humiliated in his own home, chose to turn pain into freedom. On the other, a son consumed by greed, who saw betrayal where there was love and humiliation where there was a lesson. It didn't take long for society to choose a side. The wave of support was overwhelming, Messages poured in from strangers across the country, people telling me that my actions had given them the courage to rethink their own family relationships. Meanwhile, Jason became the target of criticism. Friends drifted away. Co-workers whispered behind his back. His fiancée, Amanda, stopped answering his calls. It was as if the world itself was handing back to him, doubled, the humiliation he had tried to impose on me. And I wasn't the one who exposed him. He exposed himself by reacting with disrespect in a moment when humility could have saved him. Revenge, once again, hadn't been planned. It was simply the natural consequence of his own actions. I, on the other hand, felt strangely calm. There was no pride, no vanity in watching his downfall. There was only deep reflection. I understood that life always finds ways to reveal the truth. And in the end, true liberation wasn't in watching him suffer, but in realizing I was no longer a prisoner of his ingratitude. For the first time in years, my emotions weren't just pain, they were peace. The peace of someone who chose the path of dignity, even when it meant enduring judgment inside his own home. It's strange how the roles reverse. For years, I had felt small under his mocking laughs, under the weight of a family that seemed to ignore my sacrifices. But that day, I saw the story turn. He, who had always thought himself above everyone else, was now exposed as small. I, who had been humiliated so many times, was now being recognized as an example, and all of it without a single harsh word, just the firmness of a silent decision. But I knew this wasn't the end. The video could spread, the opinions could fly, but deep down, something else was still coming. Because when a man's pride is crushed in front of everyone, he doesn't surrender easily. Jason, humiliated in public, would come back, and when he did, he wouldn't return only with anger. He would return with desperation. I needed to be ready for the next chapter life was writing right before my eyes. The video spread through the city faster than I ever could have imagined. Within hours, Jason was known not for his talent, not for his education, but for the very scene of humiliation he himself had staged. Friends who once flattered him now grew silent. Invitations to parties were replaced by thinly veiled criticisms, or worse, complete silence. Society is harsh. It doesn't forgive easily those who show disrespect to their own family. What had begun as a private confrontation had now become a public downfall, with my son at the center of it. At work, things were no different. Colleagues who once laughed at his jokes now avoided him in the halls. Supervisors, worried about the company's image, treated him as if he carried a stain too heavy to wash away. His name, once tied to status and comfort, had become synonymous with arrogance and disrespect. I knew Jason felt every sideways glance like an arrow. It was life's revenge playing out. I hadn't lifted a finger. He had built his own trap. His fiancée, Amanda, was the quickest to leave. I still remember the day he came home distraught, telling me she had broken off the engagement. She had said she couldn't be with someone who treated his own father with such cruelty. If he can humiliate his family, what will he do to me tomorrow? She reportedly confided to a friend. That sentence spread like wildfire, repeated in circles of acquaintances until it became almost a proverb about Jason. The betrayal he had inflicted on me had turned back on him, shattering his dream of starting a family of his own. And here's a lesson. The humiliation we throw at others always finds a way back. Maybe not the same day, maybe not in the same place, but it returns. Jason had believed life was a stage where he could laugh at another's pain without consequence. He discovered, the hard way, that respect is the foundation of all family ties, and when that foundation cracks, everything collapses. You don't need to raise a hand against anyone. You only need to allow time to reveal the fractures. In the days that followed, Jason became reclusive. The young man who once spoke loudly about cars, trips, and inheritance now walked with his head down. The messages of support he had expected never came. What arrived instead was a storm of criticism, jokes, and rejection. The education he had dismissed as a child might have been his salvation now, had he learned that dignity is built with humility. But he hadn't. He had chosen arrogance, and the price was, steep. Revenge wasn't mine. It was life itself, which never lets disrespect go unpaid. I watched it all in silence. There was no joy in seeing my son suffer, no pride in his fall, only reflection. It was like watching a tragic play unfold, where the protagonist falls, not because someone pushed him, but because he failed to see the abyss at his feet. I had already felt the pain of humiliation. Now, I was watching Jason face his own. The difference was that mine had turned into freedom, while his was turning into despair. Perhaps the hardest part for him was realizing he couldn't blame anyone but himself. He tried, of course. He said I had set him up, that the media had exaggerated, that Caroline had exposed him on purpose, but deep down he knew. The cameras only showed what was already inside him. The betrayal wasn't mine. It was his, against himself when he abandoned the values that should have been his compass. The humiliation didn't come from the press, but from his own inability to show respect. And so, in just a few days, Jason lost everything. His friends, his fiancée, his reputation. All that remained was the silence of his own conscience. And it was in that silence that I hoped, maybe, just maybe, life was giving him the greatest lesson of all. Because a fall doesn't have to be the end. It can be the beginning of change. But that decision was his alone. I couldn't carry that weight for him. The education I tried to give him was a paved road, but it was up to him to choose whether to walk it or keep stumbling over the stones. Deep down, I knew. Sooner or later, Jason would come back, not with anger, but with desperation. Not as the arrogant son, but as a broken man searching for redemption. And when that moment came, I would have to be ready for the hardest decision of all, to offer forgiveness, but not the inheritance. Because respect is rebuilt with time and actions, not with rushed words. And that would be the next chapter of this story. It took a few days before Jason knocked on my door again. When he did, he was no longer the same man. There was no arrogance in his eyes, no pride of someone who thought he was heir to an empire. There was exhaustion, the weight only those who have tasted the bitter flavor of humiliation truly know. He fell to his knees before me, tears in his eyes. For the first time in many years, he didn't talk about money, didn't talk about cars, didn't talk about inheritance. He spoke only of pain. Dad, forgive me. I didn't know what I was doing. The emotion hit me like lightning. I had dreamed of hearing those words so many times, but when they finally came, I didn't feel triumph. I felt responsibility, the responsibility to teach, because forgiveness, contrary to what many think, isn't a prize handed to someone who begs for it. It's an act of liberation by the one who offers it. I took a deep breath and held his hands, but I stayed firm. Jason, forgiveness is mine to give, but respect is something earned every day, and that you still don't have. He wept harder, realizing that kneeling wasn't enough. He would have to live differently from that moment forward. As I spoke, my mind drifted back through years of silent betrayals, the mocking laughs, the words of contempt, the disrespectful gestures that had corroded our family bonds. Revenge had already taken place, not through my hands but through life's natural consequences. What remained now was the possibility of rebuilding, not a rebuilding that happens overnight, but slowly, step by step, like raising a house brick by brick. He needed to learn that dignity isn't begged for through tears, it's cultivated through daily choices. On the desk still lay a sealed letter. Jason hadn't noticed it, but I knew exactly what it contained. It was my final gesture, prepared to be revealed at the right time. A letter that carried not only instructions about property and inheritance, but also words that could once again change the course of his life. Because life is like that. Just when we think the game is over, there's always a hidden page ready to alter the story. And as Jason cried before me, I understood that the letter was the next link in our story, not a period, but a comma. Because true liberation doesn't come from closing chapters, but from accepting that there will always be new ones. And in that instant, I knew destiny still had lessons reserved, for him, and perhaps even for me. And now I want to ask you, directly, how many times have you swallowed humiliation in silence within your own family? How many times have you allowed disrespect to pass as if it were normal, just to avoid confrontation? The truth is hard, but it is freeing. Respect is never begged for, it is earned. And dignity is not an automatic inheritance. It is the result of daily choices. What would you do if you were in my place? Would you hold on to resentment? Would you repay betrayal with more betrayal? Or would you choose to turn pain into silent revenge and liberation, as I did? Think about it, because maybe the answer you give today is exactly what will shape the future of your own family relationships. I don't know your story, but I know this. No one has to live as a prisoner of ingratitude. There is always a way out, even if it hurts at first. And many times that way out is not to strike back in the same way, but to use pain as the force that makes you greater than the offense itself. So tell me, have you ever been through something similar? Have you faced a moment where you had to choose between keeping your dignity or bowing to disrespect? Share it in the comments. Your experience might inspire someone who right now is fighting the very same battle. And if this story made you reflect on your own life, on the way respect must be cultivated, and on how education can transform destinies, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications, because with every new story, you'll find more. than emotion. You'll find life lessons that can transform the way you see your family, your pain, and most importantly, your own strength.